Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Next Level Healing. I'm thrilled to bring to you today's guest. His name is Jamie Wheal. He is the author of Recapture the Rapture, Rethinking God, Sex, and Death in a World That's Lost Its Mind, and the global bestseller Stealing Fire, How Silicon Valley, Navy SEALs, and Maverick scientists are revolutionizing the way we live and work. Jamie is also the founder of the Flow Genome Project, an international organization dedicated to the research and training of human performance. His work and ideas have been covered in the New York Times, Financial Times, Wired, Entrepreneur, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Inc., and TED. He has spoken at Stanford University, MIT, the Harvard Club, Imperial College, Singularity University, the U.S. Naval War College and Special Operations Command, Sandhurst Royal Military Academy, the Bohemian Club, and the United Nations. Welcome, Jamie. Thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule.
For sure. Happy to be here.
I have read both of your books. I love them both. Stealing Fire was my first one. How many years ago was it since you've published that?
I think that was 2017.
Could you give us a little recap of what it was like deciding to do that book, launching that book, what the feedback has been like, and then also the same with Recapture the Rapture?
Well, Stealing Fire was really my love letter to the sort of ecstatic underground. And that's kind of why I started open with that story of one of Socrates' students stealing the magic potion of Kukion, from the Eleusinian Mysteries and throwing a house party where you're like, this has been going on forever. Like as long as we've had peak states, ecstatic technologies, all of these kind of things, we've had this kind of, it's almost like a spy versus spy kind of game against, the Prometheans, the ones stealing fire, right? And then lighting up the world with it. And the priests, like the ones who are supposed to keep law and order. And, they used to wear, black cassocks, and then they kind of migrated into wearing shiny black suits, and they became the men in black. They became the G-men, but there's always been this back and forth. And that had always fascinated me because in college, I, sort of had some of those experiences and was like, wait a second, what lineage is this? Like, where does this come from? And realized that it wasn't a singular lineage. It wasn't like, it's like, oh, those are the card carrying so-and-sos, and they came up in that country and they wear these badges and this is how it goes. It was this kind of broken, punctuated lineage that seemed to pop up in one time and place, one moment in history, blaze, and you could, would leave a trail or leave kind of, leave stains, and you're like, oh shit, that was it. And then it would disappear and it would bubble up somewhere else in time and place, time and space. And so really it was just 20 years of piecing together that story. And that really guided my entire education from undergrad to senior thesis to grad school. I was always just like, what is this about? And so writing that was also another thing was, in my work, I was spending time, at Necker Island with SEAL Team 6, at Burning Man and all these different places. And I had this moment speaking at the United Nations where there was a sort of a special dinner after one of these gatherings. And this was early. This was probably 2015, 2016. So like long before Michael Pollan, long before, MDMA legalization, long before any of that. And it was a gathering from delegates and various folks at the UN, and they were all getting together and they were all discussing their efforts, down in the Amazon with ayahuasca, in Jamaica with cannabis cultivation and all these things. And then somebody, one of the hosts said, and see you all in a couple of weeks at Burning Man. And I was like, wait a sec, this is interesting. What is happening here where, again, everybody from Richard Benson to SEAL Team 6 having float tanks, right? SEAL Team 6 had float tanks, and float tanks were invented by John Lilly at Esalen in Big Sur. Couldn't have been more of a hippie counterculture thing. And you've got the elite tier 1 special operators on the planet using them and repurposing them. And there just felt like there was this crazy blending, merging, intertwining of elite high performance, full-on cultural creatives and movers and shakers, and kind of, masters of the universe in the sense of Silicon Valley and the various folks that were shaping the society we were living. And they were all, sipping out of the same wishing well.
Love it.
And, and so to write that story, because that's how it had seemed to me, but in a vacuum, right? This was just the shit I would tell my friends. I'd be like, get a load of this. This is crazy. I'd be like, yeah, Jamie, whatever. And then to write that book and to have so many people say, that's my story. And, well, basically we kind of knew. I was like, this is who it's for. It's going to be for all those closeted Prometheans, right? All the people who are like, I don't want to put away my surfboard, or I like to still go and see Pearl Jam or the Grateful Dead or whoever it was that used to fire me up when I was younger. I don't like to simply drink alcohol and take Ambien and Prozac. I'm more curious about my mind. I'm, more curious about, exploratory sexuality. I'm more curious about, more interesting, ecstatic, mystic, religious traditions, you name it. And instead of feeling shame that that's like Peter Pan or it's infantile or it's time to grow up or get real, hey guys, you weren't wrong, right? Your instinct to pursue vitality, life, adventure, magic, mystery, that was legit. And it goes back thousands of years. So good to you. Then we knew that invariably those people would be like, I'm validated, right? I get to come out of the closet. Let me give this to my judgy spouse. Let me give this to my square business partner. Let me give this to my parents who always thought I was a delinquent, right? And then this story can then validate me in those eyes. And then there was this kind of long tail knock on of people who were like, oh, mate, I've never considered any of this, but you really made a good case and I'm willing to try now, right? And so that was kind of the late majority. And people who were like, I went to Burning Man because of you. I've never even thought of that stuff. Or like, I persuaded my dad, my old grandpa to try psychedelics or whatever it might have been, which wasn't the point. It wasn't the reason I wrote the book, but it definitely felt like it gave a lot of people permission.
So the big reason you did write the book was,
hey guys, studies are showing that 68% of people that watch podcasts regularly don't click the subscribe button. Do me a huge favor. If you like this content, click subscribe so other people know where to go for the cool stuff. Thank you.
It was literally just 20 to 25 years of my own detective story.
And you were
tracking down what had lit me up.
And you were overwhelmed by the response.
Yeah. It's crazy. I mean, I go around the world to this day and, the CEOs of global brands and crazy companies and famous filmmakers and, all sorts of folks.
Well, it's pretty hard not to be curious as to how Google went, 40,000x in 10 years. And how the Navy SEALs can do what they do with without speaking anything, how they kind of drop into a zone and all become one organism. Tell us about, how when you're speaking to groups of people, how do you introduce all this stuff? Because, I mean, like you say, some people have had experiences and firsthand experiences with these things, and other people, it's totally new. Obviously, your book put it in center stage that people who are high performers are turning to this stuff to move laterally, as you say in the book, rather than just 1, 2, 3, 4 arithmetic.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is it's not up to me to, I don't like to ever have my thumb on the scale. Like I'll make a case. I mean, in some respects, that was a question I had for like just structurally writing the thing, which was as the author's voice, right? How do you show up? And if you show up, you could show up as a skeptic, and many journalists do that. Like, oh, I went to check this out and I didn't think it was all going to be all that. And they do a slag piece or whatever, right? Or you could be the 100% cheerleader. Rah, 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 rah. This is the most amazing thing. And I'm just going to browbeat you until you either comply with my perspective or probably, or reject me. And I opted instead for much more the kind of, almost Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman who traveled to the United States in the 19th century and wrote about America and was like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what it appears to be like. I would be the kind of the neutral traveler. And then you can decide, and that you don't have to be sort of like tugging in the other direction because you think I'm pulling you somewhere you didn't want to go, which I think, I would hope just, as a storytelling device, works. But then also I was like, oh, and how funny is that? That's the ultimate like Odysseus trickster move, right? Is to pretend you're neutral, but you've just laid the cards out in such a way that it's impossible to come to any other conclusion. I mean, there was a very specific reason why I opened with the Navy SEALs and then Google's money and then a $4 trillion economy, because that was to inoculate, right? Red meat to the base. This is 100% conservative, Republican, masculine, macho, SEALs, rah, rah. You can't turn that one down. And then you smuggle in Burning Man, but it's with, look how much money it made Google. And then, oh, by the way, $4 trillion, that's validation you can't deny. And then we were like, oh, now just as soon as you've had that, maybe you're gonna reject it. So let's introduce the pails. The pale of the church, the pale of the state,
this was such
the pale of the body.
a mind blower to me, because everybody knows this
Right.
idiom beyond the pale, but where the heck did that come from? Please tell our audience where that came from and why it's so significant.
Yeah, it was English, violent colonization of Ireland back in the Middle Ages, and then the pale was the spiky fence that contained, Christendom kind of and civilization, and beyond the pale were the barbaric Celts, and so you didn't dare or want to be beyond the pale, and so just to think of what's within and without our polite discourse. You could also say the Overton window is kind of another expression to cover that, but. How do we get to describe and discuss these things? And we're even seeing it right now with the FDA blowback on the MAPS MDMA trials, which have come to a screeching halt.
I didn't know that. What's going on with that?
Well, because there have been some sort of snipers and ankle biters from kind of within the psychedelic community, but they're also sort of saying, oh, this is a cult, and MAPS is a cult because they talk about spirituality or spirit. They talk about there's an inner healing intelligence to a human. They're talking about these things. And it's very curious because you're like, well, wait, these are people within the nominal psychedelic community and at least espouse, we want good things to happen. We want healing to happen. We just don't think this is quite right. But they're actually reinvigorating a very rationalist, materialist, reductionist model of health and healing, and the idea that these are drugs and they are serotonergic inhibitors and they do this, that, and the other, but don't you dare say there's any interior meaning, and don't you dare say there's anything else that might be going on that couldn't be measured with a microscope or a stethoscope. That's culty, that's religious, that's bad science, that's whatever. So you really are seeing the kind of clash of the pales. What is allowed, right? What fits? And one thing that, if anything, studying a few thousand years of the history of ecstatic communities and technologies would show you is this shit just does not want to stay in the bottle.
Yeah.
So it's tricksy. And there's always the splooging of the pixie dust. And then insist that it
there's a lot of people that want to keep it in the bottle.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it's, you could also make a case. We're going down a specific avenue here on this tangent, but you could make a case that the deal with the devil, with attempting to get psychedelics decriminalized, legalized, medicalized, was in the pretending that all they were pharmacological interventions, which they've never been for 100,000 years. They've always been sacramental. They've always provided access to the sacred, to the mystical, to the mystery, right? To magic, like 1,000 other things, but not, here's a pill for what ails you because of brain chemistry, right? We played that game. All the counterculture sort of tacitly agreed to get behind that. And let's give it to veterans, because then the Republicans can't say no, and right. And like these are the deals with the devil we made, deals with the devil. And like, oh, by the way, let's bring on investment because that'll help us get to save the world faster. And before by the time you've got the FDA, venture capital, and the medical industrial complex at play, you're like, of course we're going to bugger this up. And of course, this is going to be a bastardized, simulation of what every shaman, magician, hierophant, priest has been communicating.
So for our listeners, let's look at just a few things that these things do. There was a fellow that looked at the effects of psilocybin on people who were dying and were terrified of death. And in a single dose, can you tell us about what he discovered?
I mean, sure. That was, funnily enough, it was Amanda Fielding, is the English Contessa, who was a contemporary of Tim Leary's. She, grew up in a manor house with 3 moats, and she was of that 60s generation. And then she was the one who was, clandestinely behind the scenes, funding and spearheading most of that very early original research at Imperial College in London, and then also Johns Hopkins. And that research that you're describing was Matt Johnson, Roland Griffiths, who are colleagues. Roland is now dead. But that was that original work. And it was everything from smoking cessation to end-of-life anxiety to potentially eating and eating disorder. It sort of became the gamut, especially when you included James Fadiman's work at Stanford on microdosing and those kind of things. It was basically take your pick of a human condition, and they're almost always improved, and people tend to, trust their own interior wisdom, self-discipline, control, less neurotic, less anxious, and even including more ecologically conscious and aware, less tribal or ethnocentric, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of became this bundled package of it makes you a better person, right? Which, if you had asked, anybody from the age of Aquarius, the countercultural kind of, hippie revolution of the baby boomers, they would have all said that, right? I mean, that was Tim Leary and the League for Spiritual Discovery, and we've got to dose the White House and the Pentagon and put it in the drinking supply, and then if everybody has it, we'll all be great. But there were a couple of problems with that, right? Because one is in the choosing of those, which was deliberate and it was strategic and it made sense, which is, how do we speak into the language of the establishment with the concepts and terms that they appreciate and validate? Can we say that this magic, squishy, tricksy thing, the psychedelic experience, can actually help you quit smoking, and that cancer kills and smoking's bad, and then see, we've got use and justification and validation. So can we do that? Yeah, you can. And it kind of works. But then the whole, and it's good for this, and it's good for that, like all these things. That's when it also became subject to p-hacking, which, if anybody's heard of the replication crisis in the social sciences and all that kind of stuff, where p-hacking is where you kind of fudge your results to show a stronger statistical correlation than there might necessarily be. There was a paper in Scientific American kind of saying, hey, some of the psychedelic research has been subject to that too, including you become a groovier person and you recycle and you do all those things. And it was like, we might be overstepping our bounds. I mean, what's his face? Golly, my brain is just a little tired right now. But Sydney, it'll come to me in a second, the former head of MK Ultra, right? So the super sketchy, clandestine, federal, underground, LSD and all other psychedelics. If anybody's ever watched Stranger Things on Netflix, that's the program that 11 comes out of, right? So that they're kind of riffing on real history there. Sidney Gottlieb, I want to say. But in any event, he did LSD 250 times. And he was effectively an unhinged psychopath. And he gave Whitey Bulger, the mafia mob boss who was in prison, acid over 100 times. Whitey Bulger was still Whitey Bulger, right? The classic example that everyone goes back to is, Aztec priests high on mushrooms, ripping out the live beating hearts of hundreds of sacrificial victims. The Nazis were really into drugs. So you're like, nah. The idea that we can pin all of our hopes on medicalization, legalization, decriminalization, et cetera, of specific compounds, and that is going to somehow make us all shiny, happy people. and or let us off the hook for the vicissitudes of the human condition. Just life's a bitch and then we die. And how do we manage with 8 billion people on a planet that is imploding without enough resources to go around and play nicely? Like those things don't get solved or redeemed by popping a pill. And so the more we externalize to these kind of these things, right, as saviors for us, then the more you realize, oh man, I think we might be setting ourselves up for bigger falls and harder disappointments.
Well, just simple things like how PTSD can be reduced and, like you said, stopping smoking and simple problems. It's nice to have research on that. And MAPS was in existence for how many years before these breaks have been hit?
Close to 40 at this point.
Wow. So there's a lot of data that's been accumulated with them.
There is, but here's the other thing. And I mean, and for anybody that, in your audience that is curious about these things, I mean, by all means, feel free to pick up Stealing Fire, feel free to read Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, but also know, right? If 3 sessions of psilocybin, of MDMA, of any of the compounds that have been getting, fairly well studied in a bunch of clinical trials, if 3 sessions is supposed to save you, cure you, fix you, liberate you, then why don't 33 turn you into a bodhisattva or the Dalai Lama?
It's interesting that you said the first 80% is the easiest, and then kind of the real work kicks in. Because there's work, whatever you use to, whether it's breathing work or exercise or, whatever state of ecstasy you're achieving, there's still the real work of life to apply yourself to.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, metaphors or ways to think about this. But I mean, one is like, it doesn't matter a damn, except for they're like the rainy Monday morning in February. Like that's the weak link in our systems. Like if you think about, oh my gosh, like if you've been living a life of quiet desperation in suburban conformity, right? Then breaking out of that jail cell and having an experience of kind of capital M more. There's more, right? There's more to life. There's more to the universe. Oh my God, did you just see that shooting star that happened just as I was thinking about a star shooting? This is incredible. Like the goddess is alive and magic is afoot. Thank God, right? Thank God that that's possible. That might be true, right? That's beautiful. That's a gift. And anybody that hasn't experienced it deserves to. That there's a reason to endure the sadness, the heartbreaks, the setbacks, the dullness, the drudgery, the grind, right, of this human experience. Like, hell yeah. And it's a necessary but not sufficient situation because, all that capital M more still has me in it. It still has my life in it. It still has the human condition in it. It still has all the suffering in the world in it, right? It has the impossibility of bridging heaven and earth in it. I mean, how many people have had an epiphany and then gone home and just got their asses handed to them at Thanksgiving, or the dinner table, and you're like, but I love it. We're all love and it's all one and there is only light and this is all according to plan. And they're like, fuck you on the horse you rode in on. And you're like, no, I'm like, and there you are through plate glass, like trying to take that amazing insight and connect it and ground it to the people in your life. And you're literally just in different movies. And so having, and again, that's not that surprising. It's what is surprising. And a friend and colleague of mine, Tyson Yunkaporta, he's a Aboriginal scholar who wrote a beautiful book called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Badass, super funny, incredibly good. But he talked about like us as Westerners having sort of almost adolescent questions. Like, who are we? And why are we here? And what's the meaning of life? And, all of these kind of things, right? The kind of stuff that shows up on Therapy Talk and Instagram, life coaching, and he's like, if you're a part of a culture, if you're a part of a community, like we have sorted that shit out thousands of years before you.
I interviewed Daniel Everett, who spent 30 years down in the Amazon learning how to translate their language. And he went down as a missionary to convert them, and they ended up converting him. not to their religion, but they just brought him kind of into the present moment. And, he could see that it's just a different world when you're fully present, even though there's all this danger and, conditions of poverty. But I mean, the poverty didn't bother them because it was just life in the jungle. They ate, they hunted, they communed with one another. They laughed way more than we do.
Yeah. There was a study that came out, I think, 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago, and it was a global meta-analysis of basically a quality of life, standard of living, and it was it was first world in industrial countries, but then they had gone and they had tracked down, I think, it was at least 20, and it might have been up to 40 relatively intact indigenous communities around the world, and in general, they scored higher than all but the absolute wealthiest, happiest industrial countries. There are only like 1 to 3 industrial countries that outperformed the indigenous communities. And, just said like that, apples to apples, you're like, oh, okay, that because they're closer to nature, because like they're one with the earth, whatever fantasy, noble savage Western projections and romanticization. But then you're like, wait a sec. What happened in the last 500 years? Those folks have just been subject. There's no such thing as an intact tribe that are reachable at this point, right? So those people and their descendants have been subject to war, rape, genocide, rubber plantations, deforestation, eradication of their homelands, like 500 years of just sheer horror. And they're still happier than us, blowing all this carbon and swimming in all this plastic and glued to all those screens. That's the equivalent of them being in a highway collision at 75 miles an hour, climbing out of the broken glass and wreckage, lacing up their sandals, and still kicking our asses in the 100-meter dash that we've been training for, in our sports clubs.
Yeah.
You're like, wait, this makes no sense, and is arguably one of the biggest kind of question mark / indictments of the whole techno-utopian progress at all costs kind of thing, the kind of stuff that Mark Andreessen's been talking about with effective accelerationism. We have to do artificial general intelligence, and the way forward is always better, and we're going to become a spacefaring species, and anybody who thinks we should pump the brakes is a homicidal maniac.
Well, it's interesting that a signature of feeling so much better is transient hypofrontality, which is the shutting down of the prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, most of us would gauge our happiness and enjoyment. Just take your average thing. I got 2 weeks vacation, and I've been saving up for it, and we go with our family, and we go to Cabo, or we go to Disney, or we go to a cruise, or whatever the hell we pick, out of mainstream cafeteria options. And you get back from that trip, and people will say, well, how was your trip? How was your vacation? Right? And people will pause, and they will basically scan, how many minutes did I spend not thinking about my thinking? How many moments did I have of deep immersion in the present? Right? And if I had none, right? If I tried, I sat by the pool and we ordered Mai Tais and we did the thing, but I was there on my phone, and I was, and we were sketching, and there was conflicts and this and that. And I just tried to get out of myself, but I didn't. We see that as just misery, and we come back salty. We come back pissed off, basically worse off. I need a vacation from my vacation. But on the other hand, if we go to someplace new, someplace different, we immerse ourselves in adventure. We immerse ourselves in our bodies. We immerse ourselves in connection and relationship. We have some transcendent experience, and we forget our to-dos. We forget our inbox. We rank that off the charts. It was just what I needed. It was amazing. I didn't want it to end. And you're like, yeah, and that's fundamentally a flow state or a peak state or anything else.
Who are the happiest people that you know, Jamie?
Well, I mean, there are a few, and they almost all gravitate towards the same things, which is live music, powder skiing, and surfing
Oh, interesting.
and psychedelics and Burning Man. And there's a crew. There's a whole. I mean, there's
Well, it was interesting in
probably.
your book that you compared. There was someone who did a study with surfing and PTSD and veterans, and they did great too. So I love the smorgasbord of options that you dive into, and you are very cautionary about it as well. Like, let's not make the same mistakes that other people have made, and how do we up our game with this whole thing? So. Are those the people that you most admire and want to be like, those happy people, or do the people that you model yourself after have other qualities as well that you're looking to master?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that there is, to use the kind of cliched version, but hopefully in a fresh way, there is the mountain. There's the mountain of life, the mountain of truth, the mountain of stoke, whatever you want to call it. And you have a bunch of different pathways up it. And I know people that are, again, former SEAL Team 6 commanders. So they chose the martial combat tier 1 special operations path. There are martial artists. There are extreme athletes, big wave surfers, climbers, whatever it might be, right? There are musicians. There are contemplatives, right? There are so many paths up the mountain. And what you find is a whole bunch of people just remain in the discipline they chose, got indoctrinated into, formed an identity, professional, personal, whatever it might be, and they kind of stay in that realm. But the really, really good ones, the ones who kind of get to the top of those ladders sooner and have a look around, they almost all top out in the same place. And it's that sense of like, this is life on the sharp end. This is life for all the marbles. This is life at its rawest and realest and truest and deepest. And I am here for that. And that community of communities is super dope, right? I mean, that is a very interesting bunch of people. And they're not all Jedi bodhisattvas, right? I mean, many folks still have, personal foibles. They've had heartbreaks and loss. They've, all those kinds of things. They've overcome different stuff, but they've kept seeking. They didn't stop. And they weren't confined or capped by the discipline or the lineage that grew them, they came up in. And they've kept going. And when you get to that place, right, there is a sort of sense, a quintessence of like, it's not one thing or the other. It's all in the ebbing and the flowing. It's all in the process, in the back and forth, in the moment, in the motion, in the music, in the movement, is that unnameable thing. And that is exquisite. And, and it is absolutely, I mean, you are hard pressed to beat bottomless powder skiing and getting barreled in glassy surfy waves. There are other things if you prefer them, but these are kind of the tits. They're very hard to beat. You got to work hard to beat them. There are the transcendent live music, whether that was the Grateful Dead back in the day, or whether that's a certain DJ that just rips a hole open in the floor, and magic happens. But that thing of communitas with dance and rhythm and music, absolutely intimate and transcendent sexuality, and shooting the moon / checking in with the mystery via whatever you would want to call it. You can call it plant medicines, you can call it psychedelic compounds, you can say whatever. That neck of the woods, very hard to beat. And the thing is that those are the most potent techniques of ecstasy, right? That is the toolkit that delivers you to the suchness, the isness, the unstruck sound. And it is such an expansive state that you've kind of got to work hard to keep your blinders on, because included in that is the impossibility of this human condition. Included in that is the suffering of people less fortunate. Included in that is the intergenerational traumas of this human thing we've been trying to do that has been so violent and so bloody and so brutal for so long. Included is this delicate, fragile possibility of the better world our hearts know is possible, right? All that is in the enchilada, right? And you don't get to just pick and choose the fun parts, the sugary parts, the frosting. So all of those folks coming out of all those lineages, popping out to the top and realizing, oh, this is kind of the cream of the cream. This is about as good as it gets. Like, you really can't improve on this in human form to the best of our knowledge. I think if you went any further, you'd just be pressing the pleasure buttons and basically jacking yourself into the hell realms. You know, there's some balance of struggle and striving to attain and achieve, and, you know, like, there's all that kind of funny stuff that we are required to not just have it handed to us on a plate, right? So you could be like, oh, there's this magic God mode button, and if you just press it, it's like orgasming out of your eyeballs for infinity. And what would happen? It wouldn't be a good thing, you know? So, like, it's got all those kind of funny little checks and balances, but then at some point there is that sense of, oh my gosh, this too, like, it's not just the ecstasy, right? It is also the agony. And the ecstasy is what you use to power up your nervous system, light up your spinal column, fire your synapses into overdrive, and access information, inspiration, right? Confirmation of all that is or could ever be. And at the same time, it fucking hurts. And to deny the hurt, to deny the injustice, to not deny the imbalance, the tragedy, right, is to veer into hedonism. You're like, oh, I wanted the ecstasy. I want to skim the cream. I don't want to churn the butter, right? But to actually be like, oh my God, drop to my knees weeping with gratitude and appreciation, but also obligation and duty.
Yeah, you have this great line in your book about maybe not being so preoccupied with having our head above the clouds, but helping other people keep their head above water.
Yeah, and it's not even just some like Boy Scout do-gooder thing. It's that, you know, the first 20% of your peak experiences get you 80% of your insights, learning, and growth. And it becomes quite repetitive. Like, oh, we're all love. We're all one. There's only light, and then infinite magical cartoon possibility spaces, crazy coincidence. You're like, okay, we've played that game, right? We've played it, and no one seems to be moving. So you're like, now what's the missing link? It's not that if I just go to one more workshop, if I just have one more breakthrough, if I just have one more racking sob over how sad I was that my mommy and daddy did me dirty in some way, right? It's not gonna fucking get us anywhere further than that first 20% got us. And the paradox is, in order to complete me, I actually have to stop focusing on me. And it's, you know, there's plenty of studies, you know, helper's high is a real thing. The hedonic treadmill, where we quickly adapt to how awesome things are, and then it's no longer as awesome, is a real thing. So you're like, oh, and there's also a reason why pretty much every philosophy and world religion worth its salt ever had service as a massive, massive point. Sometimes the entire point. It was like, never mind you and your personal goddamn journey. You know, like, show up and help. This is who we are, right? And whether it's the Hospitallers, which started as a crusading bunch of monk warriors, but built hospitals in Jerusalem, right? And then became, right, healing centers, right? Or any fraternal or sororal organization. We were just with a group. There was a black minister from San Antonio, husband and wife team. And they had gone from simply having their church ministry to urban gardens, urban community gardens. And they're just like, everybody has a birthright to till the soil, to raise healthy food, to prepare that food, to break bread together, to have communion. And let's do that as our spiritual practice. And let's see what happens there. And then, wouldn't you know it, right? Nutrients, alive food, health, pride, generosity, sharing. And you're like, let's do that. It does not need to be endless narcissistic personal growth workshop.
I have a friend who went to help the Asian community after some tsunami, and she's an OBGYN and turns out she's very good at creating grassroots support. And the next thing
Nice.
she's in 17 different countries. And for about $200,000 a year, she's doing millions of dollars worth of medical services. So that is really exciting to see that kind of person show up and make that kind of difference. Really, really love seeing that.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Those are the things.
Yeah.
Right? So much more than I had some new epiphany or download.
Wake up, grow up, show up.
Yeah.
Just like you say in your book. Well, I just I wanted to ask you one more thing. That you have the cheat codes for the infinite game in about chapter 13 of your book. Do you want to comment on that?
That's a good Easter egg. Well done. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, in that second book, Recapture the Rapture, do my best to try and share a sort of open source operating system for ethical culture that's transformational, that integrates peak healing and insights with community, and doesn't kind of go off the rails. Because once you get into, here we are in the rational space, we were talking about that earlier with the drug trials thing. Once you get outside the rational space, people usually or often can lose their bearings, because what's pre-rational or irrational, right, is indistinguishable from what's post-rational or trans-rational. And so you're like, well, wait, it's the rational stuff that's bad. That's the beat down, boring, dull, empirical stuff. Now I'm experiencing everything. And if you've ever had any friend or yourself who have gone from a button down, conventional, consensus driven life to pursuing personal growth, spirituality, et cetera, and it often becomes just this undifferentiated grab bag of worldviews, of truth claims, of all this kind of stuff. So how to leave the irrational behind, right? Just leave, like not get sucked into YouTube channels and magical thinking and all that kind of gobbledygook, but maintain your bearings in the post-rational takes a little bit of skill. And that one of the challenges is, in my experience, especially when I was younger, I was always looking like, okay, who figured this out? Especially of the early psychonauts and all these kind of things, like whether it was King Kesey or whether it was Tim Leary or whether it was John Lilly or it was, a host of others, or Pema Chodron and different, wisdom teachers or whatever, like who actually nailed this? And one thing you realize is like everybody has a different map. Pretty much anybody who's been playing in those post-rational realms isn't seeing the same thing, or at least in exactly the same way, and Englishing it the same way. So you're like, all right, so it's not who can come up with a better definitive solution. It's who can come up with potentially, or at least what I was called to do, which is what's a provisional roadmap of steering through infinity, which is forever bubbling up and looking different at different times and places. So all we're doing in these peak states of ours is bungee jumping into the back of beyond and landing in very different locations in the multiverse. And of course, if you've never been there before and you think it's heaven, and you're like, I've been to heaven and this is what it is, right? You're like, oh, you saw a pinprick of one wormhole on the back of beyond, and you just mistook it for the entire universe. So the cheat codes to the infinite game was, what are operating instructions? And this was, funnily enough, this was inspired by John Lilly, because John Lilly, you can even go to his Wikipedia page and they're on there, but he has maybe 8 kind of axioms or like orienting generalizations as to the way the Misto works. And that, if people don't know John Lilly, he was the one that was doing LSD research with dolphins. When that was shut down at Johns Hopkins, he then moved into the float tanks and ketamine experience. He spent at least a decade just sending it, and was a PhD MD.
Well, Stanislav Grof probably falls into this category of person that you're talking about right now too, right?
Yeah. I mean, and Stan built a model, right, with his transpersonal framework and all of those kind of things. But Lilly kind of had these provisional things. He's like, hey, there's this Earth Coincidence Control Office, and like, we control the big coincidences, you control the little ones. Everything in your life is happening for a reason, no matter how much it sucks in the moment, da-da-da-da-da. Kind of he listed them all. And it was actually amazingly restrained compared to the actual wild ass shit he had seen. If you've ever seen the movie Altered States, that was a story that was actually one of the stories that happened in his lab at the time, of like regressing into a primal, genetic, ancestor while tripping. Anyway, so long story short, Cheat Codes to the Infinite Game was basically just a sense of what are some guidelines for people to use as they collapse the waveform in their own unique ways, which no one could ever give you advice on because it hasn't happened yet and it's unique to you. But the first one is just that idea of like there are an infinite number of levels to this game. So there's the material here and now, us talking, living our biographical lives with our little names and our bank accounts and our, and our cars and our gas stations. There's that level. And then there's more levels. And the more levels you become aware of, right, the more interesting the game gets. You're like, oh, wow, this is Jungian synchronicities. This is all those, and you name it. Like, whoa, things are not one-to-one with my five senses and rational linear time and causation and effect. Whoa, there's some wobbles. There's some black cats in the matrix. That's neat. And the more black cats in the matrix you find or discover, the more interesting, but also, and this is the key, the more consequential the game gets. So you start playing for more and more marbles. Now, some people start realizing that. They're like, oh, this version, this level of reality, right, is just one of many. I actually think other ones are cooler, sexier, more interesting. I start to devalue this one. And even if you do that subtly, you don't have to be like, obviously, like, I don't value this. You could just be just playing a little fast and loose. You can end up coming up snake eyes in this realm, whether that's wandering out in traffic because you're lost in the unity of the universe, but you forget that like Mack trucks hurt, or you, and this happens a lot with psychedelics, you drown. People come out of their bodies and aren't paying attention and end up in a place where you don't breathe, right? So don't die in 3D unless or until proven otherwise, right? The only way to access all those additional levels of reality is the 3D embodied reality. So don't die in 3D. You can possibly survive dying in some of those other realms, shamanic dismemberment, visionary states, et cetera, ego deaths, et cetera, et cetera. You cannot, right, until further information, survive this one. So don't snuff it at the base layer, right? And then, arguably, the point of the game is to realize you're playing it and to then potentially help others. So if, it's that sense of like non-player characters, which are in video games, they're just ones just beetling around. They're not actually another person controlling them. They're just there for kind of wallpaper and scenery and plot, right? So take folks that are just so jacked into the matrix, right, that they're not even expressing agency for themselves and their own lives and their own hearts, souls, and minds, right? Take non-player characters and turn them into players. Like, hey, there's a thing we're doing together. Do you want to play? Right? Do you want to play with us? Do you want to play with me? Right? And then take players who are already in that and help them become architects. Hey, not only are we playing this game, but we can shape and create this game as we go. And we can make it more joyful, more expansive, more expressive, more just, right? More sustainable, more whatever. But we can actually write some of the code as well. And you tell me, do you have that page up?
I do. It's it's page 264.
264. Let's see, because I'm going from infinite number of levels and an infinite number of dimensions. The purpose of the game is to remember you're playing.
Yes,
for sure. Right. So like that's it. Like once you're in it, there isn't an end. So it's to remember we're playing it. More levels are more consequential. Oh, higher levels bleed through into 3D. So as you start playing this game, it's a very much a known issue that you will see an uptick in synchronicities and coincidences. What gets bastardized as in the law of the secret and manifestation of like I create reality, and as people get tiny little glimpses of that, it goes to their head. And they think that literally I am shaping things, but it's like, no, it's not quite that. And it's slippery. So don't let it become an ego trip. And no lineage tradition will let you do that. Your elders in the traditions would bitch slap you if you came back thinking that you can bend spoons, you know, or make the traffic lights turn green. They'd be like, shut up, you know, and go and chop wood and carry water
Ah, yes,
more.
chop wood, carry water.
Right? So it's a known issue.
Yeah.
Hold it loosely. And it's also slippery, tricksy, and orthogonal to 3D reality. So even if you begin, which is basically the realm of magic, right? Even if you begin the act of, you know, shaping reality according to one's will, which was Crowley's definition, right? It's still tricksy, and it's still orthogonal. It's not one in, one out. It's like one in, like purple or zebra, you know, and you're like, that's weird. And so there's a reason, somebody quipped that, you know, there's a reason that there aren't more faith healers working in ERs or fortune tellers as hedge fund managers, right? Like, even if they weren't hucksters, even if they were completely legit, right? Gandalf doesn't perform tricks on command, right? He's like, you know, he schools Bilbo Baggins, where Bilbo's like, make more fireworks. And he's like, I am no mere conjurer of tricks. Jesus refuses to perform miracles for Pontius Pilate.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's a long tradition of like, no, this stuff doesn't work that way.
And like the elfin queen Galadriel, who, you know, got all puffed up with power, that's not the point of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and she passes the test, right? She actually sets the ring down. So the couple of the final ones is, one is, don't, like, if you wanted to take all of nonviolent communication, all neurolinguistic programming, all, you know, consciousness of language and everything else, and boil it down to a simple sentence, you could make a case it's this, which is, don't say anything or think anything that you don't want to become more true.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean there's not sketchy shit, right? But if I don't want it to become more true, I don't look at it, I don't fixate it on it, I don't name it or speak it, right? And so, you know, for, again, back to action sports, whether it's skiing or mountain biking, you don't look at the trees, you look at the spaces in between the trees, because where the head goes, the body follows. So it doesn't mean that you're Pollyanna. It doesn't mean in fact, you know, quite often as you're, you know, climbing your route or, you know, preparing what you're doing, you're looking at all the places that can kill you. But the moment you start, you click in at the top, now you're looking at the way through. And the same in higher states of consciousness and sort of surfing the multiverse. Don't say anything or think anything you don't want to become more true, because you can end up caterwauling off into that. So then you find your non-player characters, you empower them and switch them on. You're like, hey, let's play. You invite them to the game. You take the players, you convert them into architects so we can create more cool games. And then fundamentally stay awake, right? Remember the levels of the game, right? Build stuff, right? Actually move matter, do things in the world, right? That are good, true, and beautiful.
Right.
And help out.
Yep.
Because somebody needs
your help.
The gifts and the blessings that we have been fortunate enough, lucky enough, right, to stumble into.
And Burning Man's philosophy is very much exactly what you just said. In fact, you in your book talk about how when Hurricane Katrina hit, a whole bunch of burners left and made a huge difference in the community down there.
Yeah, with having practiced in a crazy, wild, salt flat desert of how to build infrastructure and how to develop those things. So for me, the showcasing of Burning Man was exactly not about the party, and definitely not about the last 5-6 years where there's been cell service and phones and Instagram models, which is eroding the ethos of the place rapidly, even though there's still lots and lots of magic. It was much more Burners Without Borders. It was the folks that are doing the disaster and relief work, the folks that are doing solar and renewable work, the folks that are working with the Paiute Indian Reservation, the folks that are like, okay, this has opened our hearts. Exactly what I talked about with the people climbing to the top of the mountain, right? This has opened our hearts. This has blown us wide open. We hold more now. And we see more and feel more, and we are called to do more. So let's get on that. You know, and then maybe we, you know, the ratio of hedonism or party, because that's the thing, right? I mean, there is a curious thing, and Burning Man is a great case study of it, but I think it's true more broadly than that, which is the party at the end of time. Like if you throw together the best sex, drugs, architecture, design, costumes, music, vibe, and scene, right? And you just turn it all up to 11. Boom, right? That is, right, that will light up a little primate nervous system, and it will send you into blissed out, transformative open space. And it also happens to provide access in, ways that, don't bear, naming in daylight, to those non-ordinary realms, spaces, and places. But the party at the end of time, you can also just get drunk and lost and fall asleep at the party at the end of time, right? And forget that it was actually a secret Stargate, right, to hyperdimensional travel and transcorporeal, consciousness. You're like, oh, that thing is a byproduct of all that energy that we harness. But, it's if you go in the castle looking for the Holy Grail, but you fall asleep against one of those rotating walls, you can end up stuck in the Hotel California.
Well said.
So, right, like the ecstatic technologies, sex, drugs, rock and roll, basically, can be used for love, light, service, and the Grail, the loving cup, the Knights Templar, right? Or you can just end up an addict in the hell realms, and there is no difference. Like it is a razor's line between those two, which is why, like, even in some of the most esoteric Kabbalah, right, in the Jewish tradition, they wouldn't even teach some of it until a man was over the age of 40 and married. They're like, if you're a single dude, no. No. And if you're a little whippersnapper, you think you're going to rule the world, cool your jets, wait 20 years.
Wow.
Right? Like just simple things like that. And there's a reason why most of this, again, the sex, drugs, rock and roll, right? The most potent technique, throw in breathing, throw in, Tibetan Dzogchen, throw in all those, you name it, the deepest shamanic traditions. They were never openly available. They were always the secret within the secret, and you always had to earn your way into them through a bunch of other shitty, boring, dull-ass stuff that was not sexy or fun or pleasant at all before ever getting the keys to those kingdoms. And there was almost always, they were hidden, they were occluded in allegory and pun and riddle and 1,000 things, and then only ever taught to a tiny, tiny handful of people who were PhD level or above, dedicated supplicants. And now, on the dark web, you can order, God molecules and have them at your door via Bitcoin in 48 hours. You can, everybody's poly, you can go to sexuality and play parties. You can, you can shoot the moon on psychedelics. You can put on headphones and listen to, amazing transformational, binaural beat music and blah, blah, blah. And the piece that's missing is the piece that always wrapped this stuff, which was ethics and service and community and reverence. And none of those things are showing up in the medical therapeutic model at all. It's take your pill, here's your patient, here's your copay, 60 minutes, make sure you get an Uber, see you. Let's talk about integration on the app. It's gobbledygook compared to the way we always used to do this, which is these moments are rare and precious. You don't need many, more than a few in a lifetime. And in the in-between times, work on being a better person and work on helping out your people.
And something as simple as a drum circle has been shown to reduce anxiety and depression and inflammatory markers.
Well, I mean, yeah, and you take that one to the, to its absurd conclusion, and you're like, oh, look, dear, a new study from Japan says forest bathing reduces depression and anxiety for Tokyo dwellers. And then another study shows that, like classrooms with sunlight, kids learn 17% better. And then, another one is like therapeutic, outcomes are improved when there's a positive coherence with a therapist, much more so than who they studied or what school of thought they believe in. And then hugging and touch lowers cortisol and creates more coherent cardiac rhythms. You're like, oh, wait, you mean all of these studies are basically saying love and light grow humans? who'd have thunk it?
And be with other people.
Yeah. Oh, and the Harvard longevity study and its relationships. It's basically all we're trying to do is we've chopped up life into a million inanimate pieces, and we're trying to prove to ourselves and anyone else who will listen that love matters.
So well said. Jamie, I'm so grateful that you joined us today. I know your time is so precious. What would you like people to know in the last few minutes? If you had a megaphone and could talk to the whole world for just 2 minutes, what would you say?
Gosh, I would say, stormy seas on the horizon. Let's not blow this time fixing to get ready. Take whatever steps you are called to become empowered, competent, capable, and able to help. Get your hands in the dirt, put your hands in each other's hands, right? So food, water, community, competency, and seek novelty, right? That's why we're alive. What makes us feel alive. If you're ever bummed out, depressed, feeling like this is a hamster Groundhog Day, pointless, seek more novelty. That could be new food, that could be a new conversation, that could be a new place that you visit, a new experience, a sunrise and a sunset. Seek novelty. Make art. Like literally just do anything that rages against the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy ends up in a ditch. So like just leave it better than we found it. Whatever is yours to do. And help out.
Beautiful.
Right? If you haven't, if you've figured out what's new and fresh and alive, and you've made something enduring, right? Those are two beautiful gifts. Turn around and share them with somebody who's still struggling to figure it out.
Beautiful. How do you want people to find you?
Jamie at flowgenomeproject.com is an easy email. And Flow Genome Project is our organization. We go in the backcountry. We train people in all of these things. We have fun adventures. We have beautiful summertime community gatherings where we put this stuff in action. So we're doing our best to be one little, case study or example of ways you can play with these tools and ideas, and also lead leaders, teach teachers, and heal healers.
Fantastic. Jamie, thank you so much for being here. We so appreciate you and all of your wisdom and, oh my goodness, all what you've captured in Recapture the Rapture and Stealing Fire.
Great. Fun to be here.
Thanks for joining us, folks. We'll see you on the next episode of Next Level Healing. This podcast is intended for the purpose of providing information and education. It does not provide advice and is not meant to be used for any self-diagnosis or the replacement of any kind of licensed professional. The creators and individuals appearing here do not endorse any specific tests, positions, medications, products, or procedures. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.